And I want to thank you all for being here first. And I would like to especially thank our Supporting Inclusive Practices team and our CPIN team for really making this webinar. UPK, Seeds of Change, Nurturing Inclusive Family and Community Empowerment, making this happen, because this has been just a work of heart over the last few months. And so we're going to get started today because we have fantastic keynotes speaking, and we just really are excited to share what we have with you all. I want to give a special thank you really quickly to our CPIN partner, who has been really instrumental in helping us out with this series, Gloria Topolewski. She's from CPIN Region 1. If you can see her, she's going to be giving a wave in just a second. And then we're going to go ahead and get going with some logistics. Make sure that you're on mute during the presentation, but please, please, please feel free to utilize the chat and the Q&A. We're going to be monitoring that this entire time, so please feel free to use that. We have ASL interpreters and Spanish translation available, so if you need to use that, please also utilize those options. Throughout the presentation, we're going to be providing links to anything that we're talking about, and we're going to make sure that everybody has what they need, because we also have a Padlet available, and you can see that right now on the screen. That has a QR code there. There's a link on the screen as well, but Kevin's going to be putting that in the chat for us. So go ahead and take a look at the chat. You can click on that Padlet link, and it's going to be updated throughout the series. So like I said, this is session 1 of our series. We're going to get into it. The last little bit of logistics is that we all know that kindness is a cornerstone of early childhood, and we're all going to practice that throughout the day and throughout our series over the next 3 months. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Kristen Brooks, our Executive Director of the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks so much. Before I share a little bit about SIP, I'd like to thank Heather specifically for all of the hard work and passion that went into designing this series for you all. I think it might have been Heather's first day working with SIP on the job, where she started to dream a dream. And so here we are today. It's very exciting to be here. So thank you, Heather, so much for everything you brought to this series, and all of our partners on the line today. So like I said, here we are. And on behalf of Kevin Schaefer, SIP co-director, and our entire stellar team, we thank the California Department of Education and our collaborative county offices for empowering us to be able to do this innovative and important work every day. So if you are not familiar with SIP, just a little bit about our project. That we are a technical assistance project funded out of the California Department of Education Special Education Division. And our mission, as you can see on the screen here, is to provide unparalleled statewide technical assistance. We are very much an organic boots on the ground project, if you worked with us throughout California, because together we seek to empower each student, you can see, to be purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, strategic and goal-directed, which, as you know, are cornerstones of universal design for learning. With that foundation of an environment of belonging, community, and connection. So our vision is really to have every student educated in an environment that is intentionally designed. And as you all know, sometimes we need to go back and redesign those systems and those placement supports and services for our students, not only with disabilities, but really all marginalized populations, as we seek to be equitable and inclusive for every student and every space. So our tagline here is innovate, include, and impact. So we work with approximately 50 identified grantees throughout the throughout the state. Those are districts and single school sites, county offices, special education, local plan areas, to do this deeper dive of this work for inclusion and equity. In addition to events like this that are what we term tier 1 supports that are available to all individuals in California. We even have some folks abroad who tune into our events and follow us on social media. And so that is available to you all. On the screen here is a one-pager that talks more about our project, and you can feel free to sign up for any events in the future, share this information broadly, but you can learn a little bit about more about our outcome data and what we do at these tiered levels of support. So again, tier 1 is more like what we're doing today, events that are free at no cost to everybody across the state. Tier 2 is that deeper dive with those grantees that I mentioned, those school communities throughout the state. And then tier 3, supporting the California Department of Education on statewide committees, their compliance and improvement monitoring process, state webinars, things of that nature. So we are a small but mighty team throughout California and are very proud and pleased to bring this series to you all. So I'm going to stop talking and pass it back to Heather.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Now we're going to hear a little bit from the Director of the Early Education Division for the California Department of Education, Stephen Profiter. He's going to share a little bit about what's happening with UPK right now. Go ahead, Stephen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to hear the SIP team is putting on this UPK Seeds of Change series. So in case we haven't met, folks, I'm Stephen Profiter, the Director of the Early Education Division at the California Department of Education. I've got the honor of working under the kind of leadership of our Deputy Superintendent, Sarah Neville Morgan, of the Opportunities for All branch. We also work across our branch with our partners in the Special Education Division. And so really grateful to be able to have those partnerships and to be here with you all. We're really excited and so excited again, like I mentioned, that SIP is putting together this series through March to explore inclusionary practices and fostering partnerships to support our youngest learners and their families. We know that inclusion is so important, so I'm doing a little bit of preaching to the choir, and it's not only for children with disabilities. All young children and society as a whole benefit when we provide inclusive, high-quality early learning programs to children and their families. Over the past decade, the country, and especially California, has led several efforts to increase access to, as well as the quality of early learning programs. I'm going to share some of the initiatives that the CDE has been advancing to enhance inclusion for our early learners. So first, UPK, Universal Pre-Kindergarten, is part of the CDE's vision for transforming California's educational system to deliver an enhanced education promise for all children. As part of California's effort to transform schools, recent state investments work together to provide access to full-day early education opportunities, including through investments not just in UPK, but expanded learning programs, along with universal meals, community schools, professional development, anti-racism training, and mental health programs. We also want to acknowledge that the governor's January budget, which just was released last week, and share some appreciation that we have, that even though California was facing a $22.5 billion shortfall, the governor's proposal maintains existing investments in early education while continuing to expand UPK, including funding to expand the set aside for children with disabilities in the California State Preschool Program, as well as funding the funding necessary to expand to serve the next cohort of children in transitional kindergarten. In a year where we were uncertain of funding, it's a great place to be in to see some of those investments maintained. I do want to share some of the landscape around UPK and progress from many of the investments from the current year that are maintained, and how the CDE sees them working together to deliver on the promise of education for all children. So starting with the Universal Pre-Kindergarten Planning and Implementation Grant, our local educational agencies will have the ability to serve more 4-year-old children in our transitional kindergarten classrooms sooner. And many of whom are doing it before the mandated start of all 4-year-old children in 25-26. Universal access to transitional kindergarten is key to delivering on the UPK promise to provide all children with a strong and early start to education through high quality, joyful, developmentally informed, inclusive, and rigorous pre-K programs. As part of TK implementation, LEAs must also consider how to integrate TK programs into existing UPK program infrastructure operating at the local level. And that brings us to our next piece, and one of the pieces from this year's budget in supporting the mixed delivery system and addressing universal pre-kindergarten through a mixed delivery system, of which TK is a part. So starting next week, the CDE, in partnership with our colleagues at the Department of Social Services and the State Board of Education, are convening a UPK mixed delivery quality and access work group, which is a public work group to provide recommendations on the best practices for increasing access to high quality universal preschool programs for 3 and 4-year-old children through that mixed delivery model, as well as to provide recommendations on updating preschool standards in education code to support equitable access to high quality preschool and transitional kindergarten programs. We are making great strides in ensuring that children with disabilities can be served in the California State Preschool Program in the least restrictive environment. So since July 22, so about 7 months, 6.5 months now, we've been implementing a requirement in our California State Preschool programs so that children that have an active individualized family services plan or an active individualized education program are receiving services are categorically eligible for the California State Preschool Program. So we're also happy that that mirrors one of the Head Start requirements. And also since then, in this fiscal year, our state preschool programs are required to set aside 5% of their funded enrollment for children with disabilities. This is historic, it's huge. We've never had funding set aside, guaranteed funding in our state preschool programs. And to have this for our children with disabilities helps to ensure that there are spaces available for children, which I know our programs have identified in the past and as part of the SB 75 work group. Over the next couple of years, the set aside will increase to 10% so that in 25-26, our state preschool programs will be funded to serve children with disabilities, 10% of their enrollment for children with disabilities. There's also an increase in reimbursement for programs for enrolling children with disabilities. So enhanced funding means 2.4 times the program rate, the preschool rate, will be available to our programs, and the programs will also be supported to work with local community partners to identify supports and services needed to enroll more children with disabilities. And we are leaning fully in to implement that and create the support outcomes for all children. I wanted to share just a little bit on the Inclusive Early Education Expansion Program. We're really excited in this year's budget that there is an additional $200 million that's available that will be available in direct grants to provide professional development, adaptive equipment, and other pieces to enroll more children with disabilities in inclusive settings. And in many cases, the state preschool program will be the least restrictive environment. We're also thrilled that there is an additional $50 million to set aside for state capacity building, which we know is so needed outside of the direct grants. And finally, definitely not least, we are working on developing a process and a tool for early identification of children at risk for developmental delays or learning disabilities. So this is a tool that will be integrated into the state's existing assessments. And so we're really excited to continue the work on that and share more out. So and I guess just in some of to close out here, and hand back. There's just so much going on in California to transform California's educational landscape for our youngest learners. We know the research there is there to support it. We have the funding there to support it. And we're just really excited about how interconnected these investments are, and the opportunity that it prevents, and the imperative it presents us to build a coherent preschool to third grade system, as well as creating the educational system that California students and families need. Certainly after the last few years that we've all kind of experienced. It's a historical, universal approach to education. An opportunity for us to rethink and reimagine our educational system is one that brings education in an equitable manner to all students and families, and provides great opportunities for teachers and those interested in becoming teachers. So we hope you continue to attend events like the SIP event here, attend the series. We're really excited about the upcoming work that's happening here. And I personally want to thank all of you for the work that you do for California's children and their families, and for taking the time to attend this wonderful series on UPK. Back to you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's a really exciting time for early childhood, right? I've said that many times over the past few months, and I mean it 100%. We're so lucky to have the system that we have, and we're so lucky to have the investment that we have, and we're really going to take advantage of that. So thank you so much for being here, Stephen. Thank you so much, Kristen. Really quick, before we get in with our keynotes, I just wanted to make a quick note that if you do have questions or anything at all, you can put it in the chat, or you can use the Q&A feature. In order to honor the time that we have here, our 2 hours are going to go by very, very quickly. We're going to make sure that everyone stays on mute, but if you do have questions, please put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A. We've got our eyes on that, and we're going to be doing our very best to answer all the questions that you might have today. So we are about to jump in with our keynote speakers. It is my absolute distinct pleasure to have Julie Nicholson here with her keynote team, which includes Dr. Crystal McClendon-Gourdine and Raul Erazo-Chavez. So I am going to go ahead and pass it on to our keynote team to get started today. Julie.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I do want to just start by saying a big shout out to the SIP team who put this together, CPIN, CDE, everybody. It takes a village, not only to put on events like this, but for all of us to lean in and do this incredibly important work together. And on that note, I want to just start by saying that this is an extraordinary opportunity to have this series, to have an opportunity to teach and learn from one another. There's so much brilliance here, so many strengths, so many assets, so many different positionalities. And we know that we are stronger together, we're smarter together. And so from that perspective, although we can't see all of you, we feel very much in community with you. We're seeing a lot of the chat coming up. And we want that to be the tenor of what we are here today to do in this kickoff for the series. We're going to have a conversation, my two wonderful, long-standing colleagues and I, but because we are in community and because we truly believe in the power of diverse voices to lean in and do this important work together, we will call certain times for you to call to share ideas in the chat, but we actually would just invite you as things come up for you, as you're feeling things, as you're thinking about things, as insights come to mind, share those in the chat, because we want this to feel like we're in conversation together. We're going to privilege the power of story, the power of lived experience, and sharing professional expertise and professional experiences here. And so again, we invite you to share with us. We'll give you prompts, but just anytime share that. And we're going to weave our voices with yours. We're hoping that that what we share will be the ideas, the language, the stories will be provocations for you. It's an invitation to provocation, to provoke reflection, to provoke dialogue, to provoke sitting with discomfort at time and just noticing it and sitting with tension, allowing yourself to just notice when something is bubbling up, you're grappling with something, there's learning happening there, and to provoke you to take small and even large actions as a result of what you hear, what you feel, and what you take away from today. We hope that some of the things will weave through the whole series, and then we're going to come back. I will be back with you on the final day with other more of my colleagues to reflect on what you've learned and what are some of those big ideas, what are some of those provocations that you are going to bring, that you have been bringing back and that you're going to bring back to your programs and into just the stance of what you do every day to make a difference for children and families. We are going to have at the very end of our conversation a formal Q&A, and that's why Heather and her team keep reminding you to feel free to put ideas in the Q&A. We'll try to be as responsive to as many of those as we can. Okay, so to start our conversation today, we want to place ourselves in the work in the sense of our positionalities, our social categories of identity. We know that these things, how we're positioned in the work, matters a lot. It brings forward our lived experiences, maybe who we speak to, what we concentrate on, what our pain points are, what our learnings are. And so from that perspective, we're going to start. I'm going to call my colleagues in to share first. But we thought we might just share some of those social categories of our identity. And then a little bit about who we are, what we do, what we think of those traditional categories of our roles in the field. But then I invited my colleagues to each reflect back and think about a time when they were a young child. What was a memory that you hold where you felt a strong sense of inclusion? You had a felt sense of belonging, and to just share that with us. And here's the first time I'm going to just invite all of you, as the wonderful people and community we are here with today, to think yourselves about a time you felt a sense of belonging and inclusion as a child. And if you are so moved, to share something in the chat. But Raul, let's start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with all of you. As Julie mentioned, the strength and expertise that we have as a whole is immense and amazing. So thank you. My name is Raul Erazo-Chavez. I am the Executive Director of Schools and Programs with San Francisco Unified School District. And I am part of an amazing team that, like many of you, perhaps looks at policy, program quality and enhancement, and as well as systems and operations, right? Well, at the same time, I'm also part of the lead group, which is the group of directors and assistant superintendents that supervise and support and guides and coaches all principals throughout our district. And so aside from that, right, I think some of the social categories is being Latino, being a father, being a son, being an immigrant, and being a second language learner and an English language learner, right? And so I'll connect that to a time that I felt or had a moment of inclusion, I think, is when I started speaking English, right? The first time that I came to the United States and was in class. You know, I'm in this class and people, first of all, are calling my name, but they're only calling Raul Chavez. Hence, you will see me that I go by Raul Chavez most of the time. I was like, that's not me. They're not calling my full name, right? Until somebody comes and says, no, that's you. You're the only new student here. That's you. And the moment that I started to be able to speak to other students, right, my African-American friends and so forth, or other students just throughout the school, and I was able to fully participate in a classroom conversation. So talk about, you know, the support, right, the services, and the collaboration and partnership that is required in the work that we do to support children in those situations and others, as we come together and support families and we support one another in our work. So thank you again.
Thank you. And I love making visible the importance of a name and saying people's knowing how to pronounce a name, knowing how to represent that name in a way that's honoring the way that person knows themselves to be. So thank you for sharing that, Raul. Crystal?
Greetings. Hope everybody is doing well. My name is Dr. Crystal McClendon-Gourdine, and I feel so empowered right now in this moment by the history and the legacy and really the amazing wisdom of my ancestors. So I'm calling them into this space. I'm really grateful for those kings and queens throughout the African diaspora who really planted the seeds, right? The seeds of change. The way that they toiled the land, they fought tirelessly for my freedom, for our freedom, and they actually offered a blueprint for how I and other Black people can navigate so many things in my lived experience that I navigate: oppression, discrimination, racism. And so I bring them into this space and I really sit on their shoulders and at their feet, including my current ancestors, my parents who are also educators. I identify as a Black heterosexual woman, a wife, a mother, a sister, a friend. And I also believe that one of my purposes is to build community. And I'm a believer, I feel like I'm a transformer in the ways that educators think about their work, the important work that we all do. I also identify as a learner on this continuum. There's so much I don't know, so much I want to know. Although I am very well formally educated, there's so much I want to know. And what I do is coach. And I serve as a trainer and facilitator and a thought partner with so many beautiful people across the state and across the country. I also am an organizational leader, a consultant, and an entrepreneur. One of my most cherished memories of an extended period of time when I felt a sense of belonging, myself and my siblings, was in an informal home setting with a woman who later became my godmother, Ma Harrison. As a shy, insecure, cautious child, I always felt safe. I felt seen, I felt heard, and I have such a huge kind of repository of memories of laughing and dancing and playing, extended sleepovers, because we were at our house all hours of the day and night, smiles, and also long-lasting relationships with children over time that I'm still in community with today. So although she had a really small space, she was very attentive to all of our needs. And I remember that. Her demeanor was always peaceful and loving and child-focused. And she allowed us to occupy any space in her home. Nothing was off limits. So this sense of liberation and freedom was all throughout my experience. And even though we participated in a lot of school type activities, we also just coexisted as a large family. She combed my hair. I slept next to her many nights. We played according to my own schedule, my own rhythm. And I always respected her authority as an adult presence. I really, in so many ways, thank her because I feel like she gave me the wings that I could have to just fly. And that's my memory of inclusion and belonging.
I'm just feeling that. Oh, wow. I'm imagining her hearing what you just shared and realizing the difference that she made in a young life all these years later and shaping you. And I know that you have in your history as part of one of the many things you've done in early childhood is to start a family childcare. And I'm imagining that you brought some of that love and that attunement and that respect and the visibility and the acknowledgement of every child, that feeling of family. I loved how you connected the elders and the interdependence, because so much of what we're going to talk about today is based in relationships with people who are here with us, people who have passed but left such an indelible mark historically, culturally, from a familial standpoint and so on. Thank you so much for sharing, Crystal.
Sure.
So I will start by sharing that what I do in the field, I've been a long time professor, and I train sometimes with my co-presenters here across the country. I work, but when I think about training, what I really do is I build relationships. I build relationships with people all across the country who are in early childhood, who want to do work to serve children and families to the best of their ability. Sometimes they want to do things that are about increasing their commitment to equity, inclusion, accessibility. Sometimes it's about reducing stress and how to keep going and address burnout and increase self-care and so on. Lots of different ways. I'm in collaboration, in community and partnership building relationships. And I have started this year, actually a year ago, I'm in my final semester being a business student, which has been very interesting because I have loved it. I'm focusing on finance and data, and I am really thinking through very different lenses. And that brings me to some of the social categories I'll identify with, because that experience of being in a business school has reminded me that one of my important categories is educator. I come from a particular lens and perspective, and that's been different, and I welcome that as a business student. I also identify as white, as cisgender, as heterosexual, as a settler, as a mother, as a colleague, and an early childhood passionate advocate. And I will just say briefly that my story of inclusion, when I think back, I moved a lot. I was constantly moving as a child, and that created a lot of stress. I bring different lenses to understand it now. And so I often became very quiet and silent in public places and in early childhood. But I found a feeling of inclusion, of belonging, becoming a gymnast in my local YMCA and being there every day, working out and feeling that sense of connection through my teammates, through a coach, and being able to show my strength, my language as a young child. We think of the 100 languages in a different way, not just verbally, but through the gymnastics. But I felt called to feel a sense of belonging, even though I was struggling in another context of my life. So with those introductions, and thank you, by the way, there's been beautiful stories shared. I don't know, let me take a pause before we lean in with our first question. Heather, is there anything you want to just share about what you're seeing, what you're noticing?
Well, one of the things that someone mentioned was having that space that makes you feel safe enough to kind of make those failures, take those risks. And I feel like we're all creating that kind of environment virtually right here. You all are making those relationships, and our participants and our attendees are feeling safe to share their own stories. And so I just want to share my appreciation for our panelists' stories, but so much for our participant stories. They're making me kind of teary, and I really just love it. Keep them coming, everyone. Thank you so much, Julie.
And thank you for saying that, and for taking a minute to let's all just take a minute and just acknowledge that we have to earn people's trust. We have to earn trust before we can ask them to share a part of themselves that is authentic, that's vulnerable, that's honest and real. And yet we know that we have to do that in order to learn. Right? We have to be able to take risks and feel like we can bring ourself, our whole self, into the learning environment, into the learning endeavor. And you noted that sense of there's something here. Maybe not everybody. We hope that we earn people's trust, who right now people might be holding back a little, but there are some who are ready to share the story and the gift of that story, because you might be naming something that somebody else feels or experiences and they're not ready to share, or they aren't interested. But it's really validating to see that in somebody else. Or maybe you taking that risk is helping to gain helping somebody to feel that sense of confidence to do so. So thank you. We're going to work on sharing those kinds of things, trust and relationship. Crystal, you're shaking your head. Do you want to add anything?
No, it's kind of me, my shaking my head is my nonverbal way of saying ashe or it's so or amen. Like that's what I'm doing.
Shay, I love it. Absolutely. Well, let's start in. I want us to take a moment to consider the image of the child that we each are holding inside of us right now. We have a mental map in our minds of what we call the image of the child. And I want us to think about this for a minute. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why it's important to make that visible to ourselves and to name it. It's a part of the accountability of our learning process. To say, okay, what is our image that we're holding right now? And why is it important to start there? But let me first clarify, because this is a provocation to not just my colleagues, but to all of you, to call all of you to think about your image. What do I mean by that? Well, we all, from our culture, from our background, from our experiences, we all have a sense of what we think in our mind a young child is capable of, what we think are goals for them. What does it mean to learn? What does it mean to develop? What is development? What are our goals for children's development? We have images in our mind that these are just assumptions. They're just with us. We've been socialized, maybe again, through our lived experiences, as well as our kind of more professional experiences and body of knowledge in our families, our communities, and in our colleges and PD and so on. With ideas about how with learning and development, we think young children should be in relationship to adults. What is our responsibility for teaching, for observing? What is our role? What do we see as our role in that relationship? And this image of the child, you're going to see, we're going to weave this. This is one of those big ideas we'll weave all the way through. It completely influences how we set up environments for children, how we relate to them, and how we direct our focus, because again, it shapes our goals for them. So I want to start by just inviting the audience who's with us to say, just to share some words, some ideas, some thoughts that come to you when you think of your image of the child. And then we'll start with you, Crystal, sharing what comes up for you when you think of your image of the child and why it's important. And one last thing I just want to say before we hear from you is that it really, I share this every time I talk about the image of the child, because it's important for us to remember it wasn't that long ago that we had these very deficient-oriented images of children. Alison Gopnik, who many of you have probably read her books, very famous psychologist at UC Berkeley, she talks about, it was really, just a few decades back that we talked about children, well, they're so egocentric, they can only think about their perspective. They're so egocentric, they only notice their own experience, so they would never notice things like race or gender. They would never think about things like equity or justice, right? We had these ideas that they were kind of defective adults. And what we know, we've known in our field, but now societally, what we know through research, through early childhood perspectives, pushing up and out, is that nothing could be farther from the truth, right? Young children are like scientists, like from the moment they're born, even in utero, they're learning, they're noticing, they're discovering, they're asking questions. But Crystal, let's start with you. What is your image of the child and why does that matter for inclusion?
Thank you for the question, Julie. As a mother of 3 Black boys, my image of children has been shaped with the power and the potential for children. I was blessed, again, as I said, to be in an informal family childcare situation where everything was possible. Everything is possible. And so one of the ideas that I think about when I think about the image of the child that has really come from the last few years is what many of us term as kind of an intersectionality and all of our multiple identities. Just like Julie and Raul and myself have talked about the ways that we identify and how we bring all of those social identities and positionality into the space. And children also have very different ways that they show up in the world. But I think in the hurriedness of life, sometimes we discount or don't include some of the ways that children are showing up, and we miss out on opportunities. So when we talk about accessibility and what's offered for children, we have to think about what parts of children's identities do we privilege and which ones do we discount or leave out or don't really pay attention to, don't lean into. So this idea is something that's complex, and it's something that we have to talk about. So for example, one of my narrow lines of focus is around children who have different abilities, and they're also a child of color, especially for boys, right? We could have a whole series on that, right? All of that. So when children maybe they're identify as a child of color, maybe they're a child of color and they're a boy, and they have a different ability. One of the stories that I'm reminded of is a story from a mother of then 5-year-old Elijah McClain. And she courageously shared her story and helps us really get a glimpse of what it means when children are described as just different. Just different. So Elijah was diagnosed with autism. And many of us here may know or have experienced children with autism, for example. And so I'll read a quote that she shares. And she says, as a mother, all I know is that my son is different and he's Black. He's beautiful, but he's most misunderstood because of his neurodiverse brain. So since preschool, he's been diagnosed with autism on the autism spectrum, and his behavior can be unpredictable. He doesn't read social cues. He doesn't really understand authority. And when he makes a mistake, he starts yelling, shouting. After he calms down, he apologizes for causing trouble. So this mother took her child to the police station as a kindergartner because she wanted officers to understand more about autism and how he might react if he's confronted by authority, right? And so she goes on to talk about some of the ways that children with autism might behave, what they might be sensitive to, what we might need to be aware of. And so many of us, in terms of intersectionality, we know that as early as preschool and younger, children that are differently abled, that might be a child of color, that might not have been assessed properly, that may not have gotten a lot of different things, are set up for many different outcomes. Some of them are pretty tragic. Some children have the resources and maybe their experiences are different. And so one of the things that I think about when I think about the image of the child is how are we talking about these kinds of things? How do all the different ways that children show up together, does that set them up for a very positive image? Or is those combination of things setting us up to really not be curious and to lean into all those different ways that children are showing up as brilliant, yet with a different ability, yet with special needs, yet with a set of resources that may or may not be set up for them to be successful. So there's a lot more we can talk about, and we'll kind of circle back to a little bit of this a little bit later. But I really wanted to share that insight that I gained from Elijah McClain's mom about what she saw as the need that I think helps us to kind of be introspective and consider what are our thoughts about children with intersecting social identities, right? Some of which are privileged and some of which are not privileged. So when you have a set of identities that are not centered, right, in research and practicality, then what does that mean? And I think it's just a time for us to all honestly reflect on that, given our lived experiences, the research, our formal education, as Julie said earlier. So that's the pause and that's the provocation that I would offer, to really think about how am I considering all the ways that children are showing up, and where are those special children that might be faced with much more than what we could have ever imagined. So that's what I'll share.
Thank you for sharing that and calling us into reflection and some accountability.
Yeah.
And we are going to come back and touch on this idea around what our responsibility is to work on our bias, as she was doing with the police, saying, I want you to learn and expand and recognize your bias that can lead to some very harmful outcomes. We'll talk about that. But I want to just say what I found so beautiful about and important, imperative about your story that to me feels like the essence of inclusion is to teach from the youngest ages the value of human variation and diversity, that this is the normal human experience, right? And as we're trying to create that as our outcome that is shared, our North Star, to recognize that's not where we are, to recognize what is it that is privileged, and to notice your story reminds me that the narratives that were being told about him were leading with a deficit story. The focus on a deficit story that we know it's deficit stories that begin the cycle of exclusion, harm, and oppression. So you called us in to notice that. What are we privileging? What are we leaving out? Because we were leaving out all the aspects of his brilliance. Okay, thank you so much. Raul, what about for you? What's your image of the child and why is it important for inclusion?
Well, thank you, Crystal, for sharing that story, right? I think the stories are key in the work that we do. So I share in the chat, it helps us to learn with one another and alongside each other and from each other. While at the same time, I think stories such as that one are what helps us in our practice and looking at policy and looking at research and best practices, right? However, I think also I think that while we do that, right, and as we reflect in those experiences and those stories, we also need to consider what our perspective of our own children is. I'm a father of an 8-year-old, right, Latino boy, Mateo, and to us, he's everything, right? To all of us, our children are everything, and we hold them to such regard, right, to such high regard. The question becomes for me is, how do others perceive our children and view our children, whether if they're in a school setting, whether if they're in any other environment? And in that, right, I think even Heather wrote in one of the chats, that our goal here today is also to look how do we develop genuine, authentic relationships with children and their families. Since I consider a perspective of the image of the child, we also need to consider and learn from families as to what their perspective and image of their own child is. Because a lot of the times we miss cultural relevance. A lot of the times we miss that brilliance that we don't get to see because perhaps we don't engage with children in a certain way in the classroom, but families do, right? And so I think that in that, we also need to question ourselves when we come into a setting. I believe, as Stephen Profiter said early on, right? How do we make sure that our children are receiving services in the least restrictive environment? And do we understand what inclusion is, right? In the different settings. Is it a child that has a full IEP or not? Is it a child that is just in a gen ed classroom but needs more support? And let's be honest, I tend to say this, I hope I'm not offending anybody. We as adults need a lot of support as well. And so do all children, not just children with IEPs, right? So I think we need to be mindful that when a child comes in our classroom, and I'm glad that we're going to talk about bias later, is to say seldom, right? We as educators, as leaders in our districts, in our agencies and organizations, we hear people that might say that child belongs there. Where is there, right? In a special ed classroom. Well, does it? Or does it speak to our own abilities and capacity to do the work, right? Do we have the support, the systems, the resources, the tools to implement tier 1 strategies, right? The basic of things. And as we develop those relationships with children and families, we also need to consider on the family experience. Because sometimes we're doing everything that the child needs, but we're not connecting with the family. We don't know what the extent of that need is. I also have a story that touched me and my team when I was a principal in one of our schools in San Francisco. And it was of a family who we received a student who was visually impaired. And we noticed the mom will always bring her in her stroller. We realized that mom wasn't bringing her every day, once a week, perhaps at the beginning. So early on, the special ed department and us, we had a meeting to say, how do we help this situation, right? We need the child to be present in order to receive services. But for us, we started to learn that it was more than that. It wasn't just that the child needed to be in the classroom to receive services. What was happening there? Well, the child had never been in any early childhood setting before, in any school setting. Mom was the only sole caretaker of her child. And so she was very protective. And we learned that mom, even at home, would keep her in the stroller. Right? As we studied, it took us perhaps 6 months for mom to finally agree to come to school and stay with the child in class 3 days a week. And so on, we started moving forward. But what was amazing, and we'll talk more about this, is the relationship and the partnerships that we have with each other as professionals, as experts across programs with Head Start, right? With our special ed team members, right? Physical therapists, occupational therapists. And it wasn't until that point that mom felt, and I know because this is her story and she shared this with her, that she felt that she knew what her child needed. So interpretation is key, right? In the same way that we're providing today to some degree. So again, are we mindful and aware of what a family is going through? Are we mindful and aware of what the student and the family needs as a whole? If we do have this sense of community, then we need to open our minds and really look deeper. So thank you.
Raul, I'm so glad that you remind us in early childhood, we don't ever just talk about children in isolation. We always talk about and should talk about, must talk about children in the context as learners, and they're learning and developing in the context of family, of community, of relationship. And it's so important that you reminded us and brought our attention there. And what your story brought up for me was this notion of, I don't know if anybody has heard of the concept of emergent listening. And I want to just take a minute because to say what that is, because Raul's story calls us to do this. This is listening as usual is the comparison that is made to emergent listening. Listening as usual, I'm listening to you. I might, as you're talking, I'm already forming maybe an idea about how I'm going to share back with you. And if you bring up an idea that is different than my own belief, my own practices, as you're talking, I'm probably already forming my retort that is going to be respectful of you, but also push back and remind you how, what I bring into this conversation. That's listening as usual. We always do. We all do it. And what Bronwyn Davies invites us to do is to say, let's call ourselves into listening that is emergent. And what she means by that is that I am so attuned to you and what you're sharing with me. Let's imagine you as a principal with this parent, this mother. I'm stopping to focus in on you. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm not thinking about my calendar, my to-do list. I'm giving you my attention and attuning to you. But more importantly, I am willing, I'm making a stance, a commitment. I'm willing to change what I believe or what I do based on what you share with me. You're willing to change what you believe and what you do based on what you hear. And there was that sense of emergent listening coupled with what I saw is the difference between parent education, where you have experts coming in and the conversation and information tends to go one direction. We still do that. We need to do some of that. But what you talked about was family engagement, reciprocal power sharing partnership, where you say, I have some knowledge as an early educator, as a principal, but my job is to listen emergently and learn from you, because boy, do you bring incredibly important knowledge to this. And I'm going to think about you as a full partner, not somebody to teach, but as a partner who can help me do my work with more responsiveness to your child. That's what I heard there. And it's just beautiful. And the work, part of the inclusion work, isn't it, is not only changing our image of the child, but our image of the child in relationship to their family, our image of what our how we relate to families. So thank you for calling us in there. Let's just take a minute to see what is, if there's anything sort of coming up for you. We'll take a little pause to say, how are you relating to what you're hearing so far? How are you processing anything that's coming up for you? I don't know, Crystal, Raul, Heather, Kevin, are you seeing anything in the chat that you just want to give? We'll just take 1 minute here before we move on to the next question to just acknowledge, give voice to. And then also, again, please share what's coming up for you, how you're processing the ideas, the language, the stories you're hearing.
Julie, I just have to say that Janie shared in the chat. She's very open to share about her own experience with her son and how important it is for her to carry forward work where all children are feeling included, because he didn't have those opportunities, and it affected the way that he was able to interact with others as an adult. And I think that it's a really important thing to share, and I want to put out my appreciation to Janie for being vulnerable and open with this group. That's such a fantastic story to share. And it's really great that, Janie, you took, your lived experiences and you're making sure that the work that you're doing is reflective of what you want to see for not just your child, but for every child.
Thank you, Janie. That is powerful. And one of the most important factors to build resilience is looking at those stressors, those traumatic experiences, the adversities we have, and saying, I'm going to work for change to get at the root of where the harm occurred. And to do that and to work for change to improve it, not only can help you in your healing journey, let's say with you and your son and your family, but you're helping others, because this is sadly a common experience. So thank you for saying that and for sharing. Anything else, or should we move on? Crystal, Raul, anything you want to share? Okay, thank you. Well, you have beautiful stories. Let's kind of shift into thinking about and exploring, what does inclusive practices, what does inclusion, inclusion and inclusive practices. I want to just give a minute to let each of you share what that has looked like. Crystal, in your coaching, in your family childcare, in the work you do so many things in trainings. For Raul, for you as a principal, as a parent, as now a school administrator for the entire district. I want us to, we know it comes in different versions, different visions, and it should, because it's about being responsive to particular children, particular families, particular communities. It's not a recipe book. It's going to be attuned to certain values and commitments, but it's going to look different. And so let's make visible what some of those practices are as they come up for you. And again, inviting our amazing community here to make visible in the chat what that looks like for you as well. Raul, should we start with you?
Sure. Thank you. I like the comment that, and I hope I can call everybody by their first names as I'm reading them. Just want to be respectful and mindful of that as well. But I think that as we talked earlier and we shared some stories, right? Kevin mentioned LRE and meaningful inclusion environments can sometimes or not necessarily be the same thing, and yet they can coexist. And I think that's why we're here, right? We're here to shape what those two look like and mean to each other. And I think, Julie, I'm recalling our conversation prior to this session when we started talking about what is the meaning of inclusion for each of us, right? What does it mean for us as an organization? What does it mean for us as we contextualize it in the classroom, right? What does it look like? How do we define that? And how do we make sure that everybody, right, understands what that is? So, I've known for example, that we have many incredible teachers, many incredible aides, many incredible staff that provide support across our special education programs, Head Start, everywhere, right? That know what those two mean and do have, examples, are clear examples of what it means to bring those two together, right? The question is, how do we make that visible to the rest so that we can learn from one another, right? And the second part is, how do we ensure that as we look at not only what the policies and what the legal terms say that inclusion is, right? Or what an SDC, a special day classroom, must look like or provide. How do we make sure that in our practice, right, we're understanding of some of the things that we discussed? For example, what it means to have a high quality program, right? What does it mean to be culturally relevant, linguistically? And I think, Crystal, you have said locally responsive as we discussed this, right? But how do we humanize the work that we do while we're so focused? And I think I said in the chat yesterday, how do we focus on humanizing families and team members' experiences while we're so focused a lot of the times on compliance and the legality of everything else? Right? But at the same time, how do we focus on the need of the child and the need of the family as we discuss what our services look like, right? Because a lot of the times it can be very prescriptive, right? The question is that there's so much that is given from our team members. But a lot of the times we need to bridge that, as Heather and everybody else has been saying, right? How do we create meaningful relationships? And in those relationships, how do we name those terms? How do we come to agreement as to what those meanings are in order for us to understand it? How do we hold each other accountable and responsible for our actions? Because, right, are we owning our actions when we come to those spaces with families? Right, as a child is going through a whole assessment, whether they're being assessed or not for services, right? As we come into those conversations, right? The whole, I believe Louise and Tammy have used terms such as emergent listening. Julie, yourself, as Louise said, listening to learn, listening to understand. When we come to those spaces, right, are we doing that, right? Are we able to understand what a family is looking for and versus what we're saying that we can offer, right? And a lot of the times those two don't match. So in order to have an inclusive learning environment for children, sometimes it begins prior to the child getting to that environment, to that classroom. So how do we start to build relationships that are inclusive of families, where they feel that they do have a sense and empowered to advocate for themselves and their children? Just like the example on the chat where it said one substitute showed up, took something from a child, and another child says, no, we all have a right and we all learn differently, or something like that. So I appreciate that story in the chat. I'm keeping track of it because so much fits into this. But how do we develop and create spaces, right, where inclusivity happens from the offset as we work with families to develop that relational trust, right? Because a lot of the times, if we don't have the trust of the family, that child is not going to show up, right? Or vice versa. So inclusivity means prior to a child getting to that classroom. How do we build strong relationships with families? How do we make sure that they know that they have citizenship, not just that they feel like they have citizenship?
Thank you so much, Raul, for sharing. I love that image, that they have it. We plan the environment for a child to be a full citizen. Can you, before we move on, I'm wondering if you can share either an example of where you can explicitly say a compliance procedure was humanized, or where you think about, maybe it's the other way, maybe we make visible where you were part of an experience where it wasn't, and yet you say, here's how we can do better, because we need to do both, right? Shine a light on promising practices, principal practices, as well as calling out, saying, oh, I'm thinking about this. I was part of this experience, and here's, with this renewed intentional commitment, here's how I would do different in the future, because this is a learning endeavor, right? We're constantly having to just hold ourselves accountable to learn.
Yeah, I have an example that, we talk about. Sometimes there's case by case, right? And something what I tend to I'm considering a couple of scenarios and instances where we partner, right, as the local education agency, right? Our special ed department has to provide services to children not necessarily enrolled in our pre-K classrooms, right? But they attend a community-based Head Start program, a partner nonetheless, right? So sometimes a child comes to us and then they go for extended services to a Head Start program. A child might require services for occupational therapy or physical therapy. We know a lot of the times those services happen at home. But again, it's about relational trust. And a lot of the times families feel like, I don't want nobody in my home. Because I don't want you in my business. I don't want you seeing where I live or the structure of how I live. And it's totally understandable. Sometimes, people will say, no, it has to happen this way. So a lot of the times the conversation with our Head Start parents or ourselves and principals is, do we have this space for those services to be provided? Perhaps not during that chunk of time during the day, but in the afternoon as students are released and spaces open up. So we have to be mindful as to what we can do, not only systemically to name, yes, we'll provide this services if you provide the space. Sometimes it's more than that. And I think that, in many times we as site leaders, as teachers, and as our Head Start partners, we're advocating to say, but is there another space? Is there another way? And sometimes we have to challenge ourselves, even within our own work and our own policies, right? To say there's more that we can do. Can it be done? And I get it, right? Legality is always in our minds. But I think that if we want to humanize the work and we really want to help the children and really want to own the impact that we have on the children, we also need to consider how we use our spaces.
Thank you. Thank you for that example. And yes, we have compliance. Yes, there's barriers, but saying, and let's keep thinking. Let's not let those define our limitations, but to say, we want to listen to the needs of this family, attune to that, and bring in our commitment, our intentionality to just keep problem solving, keep being intentional about being responsive. So thank you. I love that. Crystal, do you want to share an example for you in your work of what inclusion has looked like, looks like, and maybe even, if I can add a little piece to that question, what opportunities exist? You're a coach and you work with a lot of programs and a lot of teachers to even increase the likelihood that children feel that and experience that full sense of inclusion.
Yeah.
Raul talked.
I appreciate the question. And I first want to lift up something I see in the chat from someone whose name is Garb BV, to everyone, to just, again, as we're developing some shared language around what we're talking about. And this person says, inclusion is giving a voice, a safe space, a safe place, and a sense of belonging to all, no matter the ability. And I also, given the question that we're talking about, want us to open up this idea of inclusion for what? Inclusion for who? Because we do talk about different abilities. I've brought up children who have different lived experiences based on their ancestry. There's all kinds of nonverbal cues that we could be open to think about, well, this child does not necessarily have an IEP, or they do not have, some more what we would call extreme behavior. So that we're just always remaining curious. That's what I would really, really offer. So when we think about what might it look like, it's almost like, who are we asking those questions? Are we collaborating together? And Julie, I appreciate you talking about what it might look like, which might be super complex. And we don't know what it might look like, because once we think we know, we're closing ourselves off from the potential that it could be something different, because we do have policies and procedures, and they're there for a reason, and they can be a guide. But there are also so many opportunities, like Raul just shared, about really just opening up the possibilities. I appreciate Raul's reminder about the importance of the family as a context, the importance of having time together. And one of the stories that I always refer to of a time when I have to call myself out, as a family childcare provider, I was not raising my hand to have children come into my program with different abilities. I was not raising my hand. I had a lot of fear. I had a lot of lack of knowledge. And I had families who, to be honest with you, they may or may not have understood or found it a valuable experience for their child to be learning and working alongside children who had a different level of need of support. And so where I would start is really being honest about where we are in our journey toward understanding it. Some of us are in positions and we have yet to really open up and explore our own gaps in learning and knowledge. And who are we talking to? Are we so disconnected from the actual sites where children are learning that we are talking the talk and we're meeting? And so it was when I was in a coaching experience in the Bay Area that I realized I full on was seeing a very complex problem for a child who needed all of us to show up differently. And by the time I thought I was centering my coaching work on the teacher and really ignoring the context of the teaching team, who was not given power or voice to say to the lead teacher, I think if we would allow him to do this in this way, we probably wouldn't experience the level of challenge that we feel. And so because I focused so narrowly on who I thought had the most influence, who did, I didn't pay attention to the administrators. This was a program on a school site, and where I was only there every so often, not there enough to really be able to make the impact that was needed for this child. It wasn't until I almost had an aha moment that I realized I need to be working, and I know Julie and Raul, you spend time thinking about the administrative support and the lack of knowledge and engagement, that I had to call in more people. But a lot of times we as coaches or mentors or whatever your positionality might be, we may not be thinking in a fuller context because we've been asked or assigned to work with this teacher on this thing with this child, and we're really limiting ourselves. So that's an example I always think about. Wow, that was some missed opportunities, but it was okay because I came alongside. It wasn't until I saw the mother sitting outside on a bench the entire time her child was in care because she was concerned and worried about that child not being given an inclusive experience. And she talked to me and she begged me to do something, right? Many of us have those stories where we have those families where you feel like your back is up against the wall because families are looking to us to fill their needs for their child to have a more inclusive experience. So I say all that to say, sometimes we might have a vision for what it would look like, but who are we asking what it might look like? I saw somebody in the chat said, children know what they need. Many times they can speak about what they need. We can read their nonverbal cues and know what they need. So Julie has mentioned attunement. Many times we know, and I work with teachers like this, they're either fearful, lack of support, lack of true resources, right? Time to do the work they need to do. There's so many layers, and we know that this is a complex issue. And so when we ask this question, I just always think about our humility and our open stance to be curious, because there's things that we haven't tried yet. There are things that we have tried that have been successful that, or not as successful, that we can try again. So I think it's really thinking about layers in the system and who else should be a part in this collaboration to think together about what it might look like. And it might mean that some of us need to spend more time observing and listening where the work is actually happening and not behind our laptops, dreaming up things that we don't know as much about as we think. So that's what I would offer, from the funders to the administrators to all the agency teams. I've worked in programs where I can't even get the person assigned to inclusive belonging. They don't have the time because they're under-resourced and they are spread so thin. So there's a lot of opportunities, from the interpersonal to the institutional, and it all is about relationships. So I've cast out a lot of different possibilities, a lot of different opportunities.
Mhm.
So I think all of us being together in seminars like this that are ongoing and we continue to develop relationships, maybe we'll have an aha moment about something else that we're not leaning into that's maybe a missed opportunity. So that's what I'll share.
Thank you for modeling the stance of honesty and a learning disposition. Because you started by saying, this is what I'm going to tell you, the real thing. You know, as a family childcare owner and director and founder, I didn't have a sign up saying I support, you know, I'm welcoming families of all types. And I appreciate you modeling that this is where we need to go to do this kind of learning, is to not feel that, to be vulnerable, to be honest about some of those pain points or some of the areas where we thought we were doing the best by children at one point, and then we learn more and reflect back and realize, oh gosh, from today's lens, I see it a little differently. To model that part of doing that is leadership. That leaders, those older visions and associations with leaders having all the answers, always being strong and assertive, you know, to make the decisions. I mean, these are old kind of patriarchal visions of leadership. And we know that given the complexity of our problems in the world today, that actually leadership, it's not that we don't as leaders make decisions, and that of course we do. And of course we bring in expertise, but leaders who are effective in guiding individuals and teams and organizations into new practices, disrupting practices that are causing harm, that kind of leadership, it requires everything we've been talking about, which is saying, I'm going to lean into uncertainty. I'm going to take risks. I'm going to be vulnerable to take risks so I can grow. And people do that better when they see it modeled by leaders and people all up and down systems and organizations. And so we have to just normalize, just like we normalize the development of self-regulation with children, we have to normalize the development of learning as a stance in organizations and in schools and in programs for adults. So thank you for doing that. Two other things that I wrote down that you talked about: the on-ramp. We have to have a safe on-ramp for learning and recognize that we are all in different places on this, and it's a continuum, and you're going to bounce across a continuum. And I just wanted to offer a tool. Some of you are probably familiar with this. We wrote about it in a book I did with some of my amazing colleagues on creating gender inclusive environments in early childhood. And it's a tool that is from outdoor education. And it talks about these almost like, think about circles where they're kind of concentric circles. And you have in the center a safe zone where things are comfortable, you're familiar, you're not pushing yourself too hard. And then you move out to a learning zone. Things are a little uncomfortable, a little unfamiliar, something you might require some risk. You still have some familiarity though, but you're also kind of pushing yourself into the space of learning, listening, humility. And then going too far beyond that goes to the danger zone. And that is where you are letting go of so much of what you know to be familiar and comfortable that you have triggered into a place where you can no longer learn. It is too scary. You have that quicksand under your feet. So when you notice you're in that danger zone, pulling it back and saying, I wonder what activated me to go there. How can I bring the learning just a little bit closer to my safe space, but also noticing when you keep yourself in that safe zone, you want to push yourself to that learning zone. So we have to build that continuum. We're going to be starting in different places, but everybody should be in their learning zone, right? We can always grow no matter where we are on that continuum. The other thing I wrote down, and I just wanted to give voice to this, not to bring in the professor of me, the theoretical part, but I just want to give some language to something that both my dear colleagues have shared. And we talk about it in a different book I work on called something called epistemic justice. Now, epistemology is the study of how we know things. And there's this aspect with young children that they can be at the intersection of these forms of injustice that we need to begin talking about. And one is, it's called testimonial injustice. And just by the nature of young children being young, we sometimes don't give them, we don't think that what they are saying, their testimony, is credible. We think they're too young to really know about their gender. We think they're too young to really name things. And I'm saying this because, Heather, you brought our attention to in the chat, children know, they know things. This brings up our image of the child. Are we listening and giving them the respect of seeing them as credible knowers of their lived experience? And the other that is attached to this is hermeneutic justice. That do we have the tools, the books, the songs, the poems, the stories around us for children in our early learning programs, for them to see those aspects of what they might describe as their lived experience? If we don't have the tools that show them racially, linguistically, all the social categories, things for them to name what they know to be true about themselves, they're going to struggle. They're going to know something's not quite right, but they're not going to have the language or the imagery or the narratives to describe it. So we want to help support children to be credible knowers of their lived experience, and then we want to give them the tools to do that and supporting that variation. Okay, I'm just noticing where we are in the time. We have 2 more questions that we're going to think about together, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. Okay, so I want us to take a turn now to think about, some of the hard stuff that is essential in this work. And that is, how do we, and I'll just say, how do you, we'll start with you, Crystal, on this one. How do you allow time in an agency, in a school, in an organization, maybe with a coaching community of practice or team building exercise, to create the kind of space that's both safe and brave, that learning space, that sweet spot, to have people in community together thinking about what gets in the way of inclusion, the barriers, the challenges, whether it's our image of the child, our image of the family, or the bias, or maybe just the outright discrimination that some of our policies and practices are perpetuating. Let's just think for a minute about if you can share a specific example of what this can look like to say we're going to be intentional about creating a space or a time or a commitment to do this work on addressing the barriers. Yeah.
I'll say a couple of things, and then I want to make sure I leave room for Raul or you, Julie, to speak on it. I think everything starts and ends, well, not ends, there's no end, starts with a readiness. A sincere desire, a sincere readiness to know what we don't know and to do it alongside others. So it's that bravery and that courageous, kind of tickle in your being that says, I know that I need to do something or I need to make a change. And so in my work, working one-on-one or with a small group of people, it's really about just really kind of setting with the fact that the reality is that we all individually and collectively need to do this work together. So I think it just starts really with some readiness. We talk a lot of times about community agreements, and we say we're going to stay engaged and all these kinds of things. And so it's really owning that commitment to try something, like you just said, the learning zone, out of my comfortable space, not in a dangerous space. And so I would just say it takes time. There's no quick fixes to this thing. And so when I'm asked to come in and work, it's just getting to know people in the way that they want to learn, the way that they want to engage, and try to speak to that, try to model a parallel process for how I want for them to be able to begin to be more open with children. I'm glad that we're talking more about mental health, and we're talking about it for the young ages. We're talking about it the entire range. But I think to really just, as you mentioned earlier, Julia, about triggers. And so I can sit and facilitate, not to get to the goal that we have on the paper, but to say, let's get to this place so that when I'm not here, you guys have a foundation for how to be together. That's super, super key. And I don't want to gloss over it. So having time to develop safety and trust and ability to take risk, and that you're willing to do that, right? It's almost like you go to the gym and you know that you've been lifting that same weight, but you actually need to lift a heavier weight. And so you have somebody there that's saying, no, 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 you've been on that same train, that same weight. Let's do something different. And then we make note of it. We're writing about it. We're exploring it together. And so for me, it's about, am I whole and sound, and I have a why that's going to connect with their why, and helping us all to say, we can share that so that we can demonstrate our ability to move towards something. Because you can talk around something, an agenda, something, and meeting something, and nothing is moving. So that accountability is just consistently checked. Where are we? What are we doing? Can we situate ourselves and ourselves together? So me, myself, me in connection with Julie, in connection with Raul. And then start the healing process, because we really in some ways have to work alongside the children and the families we serve by just identifying where also we need to heal. And we don't talk about that. Because many of us are sharing stories about our individual experiences, and we're bringing that passion into the work, but we also have to bring in the fact that we still very much have to work on those places, those pain points, those other things too. And we don't really talk about it because we've got a resource and we've got a book and we've got a thing. But humanizing, as Raul talked about earlier, is identifying that I might be on a continuum of readiness, right? I might be the lead teacher, but I'm not ready. Someone else who's assistant teacher is more ready, that commitment. So when you ask, how do you set up those spaces? It's just to be really authentically honest. Like I just said, I was the family childcare provider that did not advertise, that I wanted to bring in because I wasn't sure how it was going to be. I didn't know if the resources were going to be there for me. So that's what I do, is to just put myself out there as a vulnerable learner, a person who's committed to curiosity, to exploring together, and to call myself out and to call others in to doing the same. And I think it's when we really get deep around, yes, I'm ready, or no, I'm not. I say to teachers, I don't need to be here. If you want me to check back with you in a year, I'm coming back. Because there's a lot of other teachers that are not getting what they need, or administrators. So I think for us to say, am I on this journey along with you, or is it going to be a stumbling block? Because we know, Julie, we've talked about this in anti-racism work, we can do more harm by trying to push people into something and convince them of something that they're not ready to be open to. So I'll stop there, but that's what I would share from my own experience that has led to real change and real commitments to change over a long time.
Thank you. Before we go to Raul, can I ask you to just speak to that tender place of, you've invited, there's not a complete readiness to jump in and dive in, but you said this word or this phrase, calling in. So what's that provocation of saying, I'm not going to exempt you entirely and just say, you're good to keep going with your status quo. I'm going to have a little invitation that calls you in and recognizes that there's a time period by which you might need a little runway before you're ready to do what we're doing with this group. But I'm also not going to just forget and decide it's okay to move on, right? Where's that? How have you worked with that tension of calling in and recognizing the different places of readiness?
Yes, really great question, because you're right. You can't just kind of leave people where they are without acknowledging. And so I would say when I have permission, I use shared observations and shared data to think about what is actually happening and to think together about what is my role in what's happening? Where is my place of impact and influence? And so you can say, no, not me, no, not right now. And we also very much can, document together what's happening, like really, really, really through observation, through listening, through talking. And I would say the second and last thing I'll say is most of the time when there is that tender, tense moment, it's because there's an unmet need that educator has. Mm-hmm. And that unmet need is going to get carried out to a little bit of, adult tantrum, adult, I'm just not going to, because there's a lot of other things that are not attended to for myself. Mm-hmm. And that's been a hard place to be in, because in my positionality, I don't necessarily have the level of influence to impact that thing, but that's the thing that's getting in the way of it's moving toward what children and families need. Mm. And again, if we don't address our own healing, then that's where it's going to all kind of unravel. Now, I haven't figured out how I'd move through that. That's a place of learning for me. Mm-hmm. I sit there as a listener, but listening can only take you so far. Emergent, I appreciate that invitation to learn more about emergent listening, and it helps for a short while. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times that readiness and ability to change, there are a lot of us that really, really, really need a deep sense of healing. And so I can share the data and it can be hard and people can still stay where they are. And so I've grappled with what do I do? Because we know we're kind of on timetables and things. So how much time am I going to be able to authentically spend when the need is so great? I don't know if that answers your.
It's so important what you shared, because you gave us so much to think about. You started when you first began sharing about the importance of connecting people to their why. You brought us, though, to this continuum of readiness. And what I really appreciated, what you just shared, Crystal, is you're doing what both you and Raul have so beautifully kept our attention on, which is humanizing this work, whether it's with children or adults. And you didn't go to the place of, well, when those educators aren't ready, I just have to, you didn't use words like resistance or, some kind of word that put blame on their shoulders. You said there's a need that's not being met. You humanized the experience of what they're doing, which makes sense when we think about it through. And you said, if we don't meet that need, they can't go on this journey. And so that calls in the need to resource our communities. We can't exempt our budget decision makers, our policy makers. I mean, everything that Stephen Profferter spoke about, I kept, as a business student in finance, I kept thinking about all those dollars. But we have to think about that. We have histories of being under-resourced and people, like you said, being harmed by systems that take advantage of their positionality and ask them, right, how many systems have early educators who are not, we don't have the compensation to pay them the wages that they deserve. And so what do? They do the work and have the lower compensation. They, in essence, are filling the gap for a system that will not resource them properly. So we have to acknowledge that. And that's really an important part of, I think, this conversation about inclusion is, how are we caring for the carers? What are the contexts that our workforce is working within? And this, I just want to bring to people's attention one of the resources on the Padlet. I don't know if you found this valuable. It's the 2022 U.S. Surgeon General's. It's a framework for workplace mental health and well-being. And in this framework, it talks about these different essentials that are what we want to see in our workplaces to support well-being. And inclusion is for adults, is built in to the frame. It's right there. It's actually highlighted. And I'll just quickly say the 5 essentials to support workplace mental health and well-being: protection from harm, connection and community, work-life harmony, mattering at work. Let's think about Bettina Love's powerful work on mattering, and opportunity for growth. So that's just one tool, but it makes visible that we need to think about the conditions in which we are all working and make sure that we are striving for inclusion in those environments. You can't pour from an empty cup. We always hear that. And you can't pour from a cup, even if it's not empty, but it has a few holes in it. Like we can't, not to say people have holes in it, but just we have to think about the environments in which we are asking people to do extraordinarily hard work. Emotional labor, attunement, connection, relationship, these things take a lot. And so we need to resource the carers. Raul, what would you like to share about making time and agencies for this important work?
I think you yourself, Julie, Crystal, and our fellow colleagues in the chat are naming it all, right? I think it comes down to the culture and climate that we want to set in our learning spaces and our workspaces as an organization, as an agency, in order to create that space where people feel that they can make mistakes and feel vulnerable, right? And seldom in meetings, I used to tell my team when I was at a site, at a school site, okay, no judgment of each other or parents. Now that's tough because we're human beings after all, and it does happen. So what I used to say is, let's name it in the conversation, right? What comes up? If we are going to address our biases, if we are going to work through an anti-racist framework, right? And we want to be anti-racist leaders, what does that look like? What does that culture and climate look like? How do we open those opportunities in our learning spaces with our colleagues, with our peers? Because in that space, I don't think it comes to like, I'm the boss, I'm the director, I'm this. It's about being together and being one and honoring one each other as colleagues, right? And as you said, continuous learners, right? And I want to honor and also some of the things that are in the chat, because I wrote here that we were reminded, right, that inclusion benefits all students, not just those, right, who have a specific IEP or something, right? I think Kevin put that in the chat. So thank you for reminding us of that, because I'm making that connection to our biases, because seldom we tend to think that, right? And one of the things that we haven't talked with as we discuss the culture and climate in our space is access to our team members, right? To have the opportunity to be vulnerable, but access to resources and trainings or tools, right? I think Crystal said it, right? What are those unmet needs? If our team members feel like we're not addressing their concerns, their issues, their questions, they're not happy. And so we have to think, what's the mindset that they bring to the classroom, to that learning space, to that teaching space, right? And so I wonder, right, how to meet that need. And the second thing that was also said is something that we haven't talked about, and I think, I didn't write the name, but somebody wrote, inclusion means when children feel safe, comfortable, and welcome. And as you just stated, that's also for the work environment, right? So if our team members feel that sense of security, right, their performance will show, but it's not just performance, right? It's that they show up. And one of the things that I've learned through COVID, there's bad and there's good, is how we came to work together and support one another. How many wellness checks didn't we do on one another? How wellness checks didn't we do on family, students, and team members? How do we continue that though, right? Because the minute that that's gone, it's like, oh, we don't need that no more. No, those systems and structures that we set in place were done at a human level. So how do we continue that? But how do we continue to make sure that at the same time in those spaces, we're able to be vulnerable and courageous enough to call and question each other on what we say? Seldom when I have issues and concerns from staffing, right, harassment and issues like this, because somebody said something that didn't sit well with you. And yet, as early childhood educators and teachers from the many organizations and LEAs present here, we tend to teach children how to do that, how to give iMessages, and yet we struggle with that ourselves, right? I can't say, Julie, you know what? And I have colleagues that have called me out myself several times, right? I had to own it myself, that my actions have an impact on somebody else. And because they're courageous enough and they have that relationship with me, they're able to tell me. The question is, as we said earlier, we're able to listen and act upon it and reflect before we act, right? The other thing is consider to talk that yes, right? Inclusion means where children feel safe, comfortable, and welcome, but it's also access. I'll give you an example. And we do instructional coaching, we do walkthroughs at our schools in our learning spaces, right? Sometimes we see that children don't have the same access to manipulatives or other things in the classroom. And the answer is something like, well, they don't know how to use it and they're gonna throw it. But that mindset itself, right, keeps a child from learning on how to use those tools, on how to work through a space, on how to develop those skills and capacity as they grow, right, to adulthood. The second part is access to families. And I appreciate that somebody put in, I think Louise put in Dr. Brazelton's touch points for relational framework. We're sharing resources, we're sharing tools here. It's about learning. It's access to families, because seldom we meet with families and we say what we are able to do. And sometimes we refrain from saying what else is there. There's something else outside of our own agencies. There's something else out there. There's another group that can help you. And so I think that's important, right? That we don't see ourselves as limiting those experiences and opportunities for families and students, but that we are helping them to have access to all of those tools. I think Donna said it best, social and emotional buildup and self-love is crucial. If we as an agency, as an organization, whatever we are, however small or big we are, right? How do we set the culture and climate to let them know that we can be vulnerable, that they're respected, that they're valued, right? And in doing so, again, how are we able to name perhaps things that are said that really cause harm upon others, right? Because if it causes harm in our space, it's going to cause harm out there. And so then that itself hinders those relationships. So we need to be mindful that it has to start with us, right? That we are able to allow others to question us in what we say and what we do, right? So that then they can feel comfortable when it is done as a whole. But how do we set the tone? How do we set that space?
Love that. I just want you to take a minute to think about how what Raul just said connects or deepens your why you're in this work, what you're doing this work for. And Heather, I know that we have time for just a few questions here, and then you have some closing comments you want to make, but I want to call everybody into a task while we're addressing some questions. And that is, I'd love to share in our last 15 minutes here together, have you all share in the chat. How are you moved? Remember, we said this was a provocation for reflection, dialogue, and action. So how have you been moved today into a particular reflection, maybe a dialogue, an idea, or a term, definition that you want to bring back to colleagues, or an action that you want to take? The reason is because we want to ask ourselves, how are we honoring our promises, our commitment to learning about inclusion? And we can start here today. So if you could begin thinking about that and sharing ideas in the chat, we'll gladly now shift into about 10 minutes of questions. And do you want to lead us through those, or would you like me to open up the Q&A?
I think, Julie, I'm just really thankful and grateful for how open this conversation was today. And we had a couple of questions from participants about how are we going to see all the wonderful things that were brought up in the chat boxes over this time. And I want to reassure everyone that I'll be saving the chat, and I really am going to work on organizing the chat and the comments to kind of go along with your talking points. And that's going to be something that's going to be added to our Padlet so that we don't forget all of the valuable things that happened together today, and also so that we can kind of capture those movements that everyone's kind of thinking about right now. I know for me, I added in the chat a while back that my commitment is to always presume competence, always presume that someone can do something, that individuals can do things. And it's really important for me because it helps me approach any situation with that, well, this is going to go well, right? If someone can do something, this is going to go well. And even if they show that they are not yet ready to do it, at full skill level, if you're approaching something and saying they can, they will, it makes everything so much more, it makes everything easier. It makes the interaction more positive. So I think that for me is that movement. I'm going to move forward and say, whoever I'm working with, if it's a school district, if it's a child, if it's a family, they can, and I'm going to appreciate what they can do.
Love that. That's powerful.
Right.
And folks are sharing some wonderful ideas. So Heather, I'm going to let you guide us. Should we read out some of what's coming up, or would you like to ask? I haven't been following the Q&A. I don't know if there's questions there that need to be addressed, because we could certainly just highlight what's coming up in the chat.
I would love to highlight what's coming up in the chat right now. So
okay, let's do that.
Why don't we take turns going through? I think I'll start. And I see from Lana saying throughout this webinar, they've been thinking about the power of self-reflection. When we can truly reflect on our own values, perceptions, and beliefs, and engage in conversations with others about their values, perspectives, and beliefs, that's where collaborative relationships can be built, so we can truly engage in creating and providing for inclusive environments for all. Oh, wow. What a wonderful statement. Thank you so much. Does anybody see anything else in the chat that's standing out to them?
I want to bring something up that Kirsten Cooper said about our thoughts about transitioning our language from inclusion to least restrictive environments, to give the idea that using the language of inclusion means that perhaps a child or a family have been previously excluded. So just thinking about the language that we use, because language really does matter. Our words are so powerful. So I'm curious if anybody wants to say in the chat how they feel about that, or any of the facilitators, co-facilitators. Least restrictive environment, so as not to imply that someone was previously being excluded.
I'm going to lift up the idea here, Nick Brown says, of mental health and wellness in the workplace. And that is so important for building inclusion. In our office, we say, if you don't feed the teachers, they eat the students. Got it. We understand. But, we said in a few times today that we want to get out from underneath this idea of seeing the child outside of the context of family and community. And then Raul and Crystal and so many of you reminded us, called us in to remember the workforce in the context of children, families, and communities. And the same for families. Raul, you said, let's connect families to the resources in their community and not just thinking about ourselves as educators, that there's a lot of context that, they can be connected to. So that interdependence is one of the things I'm seeing in that quote from Nick that he reminds, that comes up for his staff. Somebody here was interested in epistemic justice or injustice. And what I can do with your beautiful Padlet, don't you all just love Padlets? I just feel like my whole life is now going to be on a Padlet. I can upload something if that's of interest to you, because we've been really exploring this idea a lot. That theory came about from studying the workplace and women's experience, especially women, not only women, but especially women's experience of sexual harassment. Several decades back, there was some theorizing around, well, they knew they were having an experience and they didn't yet have the language, or there wasn't a language in the workplace that was normalized to talk about it. So, and then when they did talk about it, they weren't listened to and trusted. So that was the testimonial injustice, and the hermeneutical was not having, things that we have today about safety and HR practices and protocols and things in place. So that's where it came from, but we think about applying it in early childhood to the image of the child.
I really want to encourage everyone to continue to add their thoughts into the chat. There's some really great things coming up. Like I said, I'm going to make sure that we organize the comments and that they're available to everyone, because boy, what a valuable conversation. And how great to have this many people here together and really feel like, we're having a conversation. I just love that piece. And someone had mentioned earlier that this whole session feels so inclusive, and that's exactly what we want everyone to feel. And you can really tell by how open and vulnerable people are being, and how willing y'all are to share pieces of yourselves with us. So I just once again have to share my appreciation and gratitude for the knowledge that has been shared here today.
Heather, if you don't mind, I would like to, Stephanie says, as a special educator teacher, being a part of the general education program for the past couple of years has opened my mind and those of my colleagues, the importance of supporting all students and not thinking that just students with IEPs need additional support. Thank you for that. I also want to say thank you to you and to everyone in this special ed world, because you have enlightened not only my experience, but also that of many, for allowing us and for advocating for children and allowing us to see their true brightness and everything that they're capable of doing and the possibilities that they have. So thank you.
Well, here we are, Heather, it's 4:55 and you wanted the last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that this is I started here, but it's an extraordinary opportunity to build momentum for a vision of the future where every child has a voice, feels safe and included like a full citizen, and families too, and the workforce, and just, wow, it's amazing to be in community with all of you. And let's go continue forward in this awesome opportunity and giving ourselves grace, giving each other grace. That's what it takes to learn together.
And speaking of moving forward, I will share our next session. Here it is. So as we come to an end here, I just want to thank everyone for being here today. Julie, Crystal, Raul, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to Stephen, thank you to Kristen for sharing about our organizations. Please, please continue to share information about this series. You can register all the way through the very end. The CPIN session that's coming up next week, next Wednesday, January 25th, 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, is Inclusion Works. And I, along with Cindy Kopp, will be delivering the training. And we're going to be able to hear too a little bit more from Gloria and Julie, who is the executive director for our CPIN project across the state. And so that is where you'll be able to receive the first 3 hours of professional growth. And we have the resources that you need to participate in that CPIN training on the Padlet right now. So you can get a jump on it. You can take a look at the Inclusion Works document and the supplemental documents. They're all there for you to see. And we really just hope that you all join us again next week and throughout the rest of this series. On behalf of our SIP team, our CPIN team, our fantastic keynotes, thank you all so much for being here. If you have questions or anything, you can stay. We'll stay for a little bit longer, but otherwise have a fantastic and a safe night. Thank you all so much for being here.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Thank you again.
Take care.